Turn over a new leaf employee investment series. Today is part 2. We're going to be talking about causes of turnover. Today's presenting team, I am Mary Musa Rogers. I am, for those of you that haven't watched my previous video or met me, I'm completing my PhD in clinical psychology, currently working at CCSI, and this is a big part of my research with them. We also have Carson Scott, who has a master's degree in sociology. He's currently finishing his master's of social work program at Nazareth and has been an integral part also in the research for this series. And then we have Chris Copeland, a former CEO and current director of consulting at CCSI with us today. So, quick overview. Today we are talking about causes of turnover. What does the research say causes turnover? We're going to be defining some terms that you might be familiar with. We'll be talking about what burnout is, what contributes to burnout, what terminology maybe even relates to burnout. And then from terms to real world, we're going to hopefully have some time at the end to talk more about some of the things that supervisors and organizations do specifically that contribute to burnout. And just a reminder, right, we have 2 more sessions in this series after this. We have assessing turnover and solutions to turnover, so don't lose hope yet. I know that today we're talking about causes of turnover and that can feel kind of hopeless, but hopefully we're empowering you to understand that these last 2 sessions are really where you're going to get the solutions portion. So first, let's begin by briefly discussing a model of turnover, or more specifically, turnover intention. Turnover intention is just as you suspect, which is when an employee is considering or intending to turn over or leave their position. This is often measured by statements on like a survey or a questionnaire, such as, I'm actively looking for another job, or as soon as I find another job, I'll leave the job I'm currently in. Major aspects that relate to turnover intention are things like job burnout, which might be a very familiar term to all of you, and we'll discuss more in a moment, and workplace incivility, or difficulty getting along with coworkers, and more often, and more seriously, supervisors. And so as you see here, job burnout, workplace incivility also impacts job performance in addition to turnover intention, right? So this impacts job performance, which in the human services context often relates back to burnout, right? Because when a human services professional is not able to do their work well, they often start to experience more symptoms of burnout. But also, right, it relates directly back to that feeling of wanting to leave or intend to turn over. So how many workers are intending to turn over? Last week, we learned approximately 30 to 35% of behavioral health workers turn over depending on the type of facility, but on average. And according to a report in 2019, 30% of behavioral health workers intend to turn over. So that means the majority of annual turnover is likely to come from individuals who are already thinking about leaving their jobs right now. That survey also found that 70% of employees are monitoring external work opportunities. So once again, these are numbers that can be influenced with the right changes to organizational culture, to organizational policy, and also to leadership behaviors. Although we know turnover is overall expensive, we also know that a major cause of turnover is stress, which relates to about 60% of workers' comp costs, 10% of medical prescriptions costs, and about 40% of turnover costs. And these are probably conservative estimates, right? We probably can say that a lot more of these are related to stress, or higher numbers of these are related to stress too. So what is stressing behavioral health employees out? Here are some suggestions, right? So 46% of employees reported lack of opportunity for growth and advancement. 42% reported heavy workloads, right? Heavy caseloads, often in human service workers cases. Unrealistic job expectations, 39% were reported. 39% of employees reported long hours, 52% reported lack of non-monetary rewards and recognition, and 33% reported supervisors. So just about a third of employees are reporting stress from their supervisors, which again are probably somewhat conservative estimates. Furthermore, the employees that stay report in order these factors as to why they're still at the workplace. So we have career development, work-life balance, senior-subordinate relationship, right? So here we have kind of the inverse of before, where a third of workers report that they're experiencing stress from their supervisor. Then you have the third top reason that employees are staying is because they have a positive or quality senior-subordinate relationship. Then you have motivation at fourth. Fifth is compensation, all the way down there. With organization commitment, training and development and working environment following that. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I think that many of these aspects can be influenced by organizational policies and procedures, even when we kind of feel stuck at the compensation level. Well, we really can't increase compensation, but with compensation down here at 5th, we see that there's all these other aspects that we can really do a lot more about in terms of helping our employees. In addition to general work stressors, there's also the issue of inclusion and diversity, and also trauma-informed kind of pieces with leadership. So reports suggest that about 84% of employees report a lack of attention to diversity and inclusion, which contributes to turnover. 42% of employees report perceiving a bias against diverse backgrounds. And we also know from research that microaggressions increases turnover and tension in employees. So these are all aspects, again, that with the right trainings and the right organizational policies in place, we can reduce a lot of the impact of these stressors on workers. So we know there are some work aspects related to stress for employees, and then you have some of these terms you might have heard before, right? Burnout, compassion fatigue, stress contagion, moral injury, value discrepancy. Maybe these last terms, moral injury and value discrepancy, you've heard a little less about. But these are all important as they capture clusters of experiences that can be particular to human services workers. In addition, we also have another model that was created by Hudnall and Stam. This is the professional quality of life model. This demonstrates that when a worker has high professional quality of life, they're likely to have high compassion satisfaction. And when they have lower professional quality of life, they develop compassion fatigue, which we're going to talk about more in depth in a moment. Burnout then comes after that, or vicarious or secondary trauma, which are not mutually exclusive. Oftentimes, human service workers might even experience both. So, what is compassion fatigue? Compassion fatigue is the exposure to human service work, types of work. The exposure to human services types of work can lead to fatigue and compassion and make it difficult for behavioral health workers to do their jobs as successfully as they would prefer. So there's a lot of different symptoms that individuals can experience when experiencing compassion fatigue. Some of the typical ones listed are feeling overwhelmed, feeling hopeless, feeling helpless to reduce other suffering, reduced empathy for others, limited stress tolerance, changes in belief systems. There's also, just other types of emotional symptoms, numbness, limited tolerance for stress, kind of dwelling on or ruminating on aspects of work that are harmful. Compassion fatigue also is more specific to human service environments than burnout, where burnout can occur across different types of jobs. Compassion fatigue is more often seen in these human service work relationships where they're trying to help another individual. Compassion fatigue may also have a faster recovery than burnout, especially since it's kind of, as you saw in that previous model, a step above burnout. This model, compassion fatigue symptoms can also appear more rapidly than burnout, which tends to appear more gradually over time. And it, as I mentioned, may have that faster recovery. Oh, I think I hit. There we go. In addition, compassion fatigue can also relate to secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma, as again shown in that model above. Secondary traumatic stress is the indirect exposure to traumatic material that leads to PTSD similar symptoms and can happen kind of suddenly after one session. The presence of these PTSD-like symptoms can be caused by at least one indirect exposure to traumatic material and can happen over just one session, one therapeutic session. Secondary exposure to extremely stressful events can lead to symptoms in rapid onset, feeling afraid, difficulty sleeping, images of upsetting events. Vicarious trauma is a little bit more slow than secondary traumatic stress, where they may be experiencing a post-traumatic response that parallels the people they're being served. It typically happens more gradually and over an accumulation of exposure over time. And typically the bigger piece with vicarious trauma is that you'll see that this individual the employee experiences more of a profound shift in worldview, either psychological or spiritual. So they start to kind of view the world as more of a dangerous or negative place to be, which can impact their ability to do their work in a variety of ways. Something else also I'd like to mention about secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma is that there's a lot of people, you'll see some mixed literature or research on this, and part of this is because these terms have some stigma attached to them, especially for victims of trauma who are working with therapists and behavioral health workers. And so some people prefer the blanket or larger term of compassion fatigue rather than secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma, which implies that a victim of harm or a victim of trauma is now resulting in the harm of the person they're working with. And so you can kind of see how that might be attached to stigma with help seeking. So we've gotten through a couple of terms, but what is burnout, right? Burnout is the term that we've heard over and over again. It's this syndrome that's characterized by exhaustion, depersonalization, and diminished efficacy. The typical symptoms listed by the World Health Organization are feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. So do you think this definition is missing anything? Is there anything that burnout looks like to you in particular? Let's see if anybody wants to chat in, a brave soul. Or do you think this pretty much covers it? Okay. So I'm going to go with the assumption that most people think this about covers the definition, and maybe you're thinking of some examples right now, but research shows that there are different work aspects that relate to the different symptoms of burnout. So in a research study by Scanlon and Still, they examined work factors that predicted symptoms of burnout, such as feelings of depletion or exhaustion. And what they found were things like high emotional demands. Oh, I see now. A bunch of chats just came in. Thanks, y'all. So I guess it just didn't come through a second ago. So I'm seeing reduced capacity for compassion. That pretty much covers it. Not showing up for work, lack of motivation. Thank you so much. Procrastination. Oh, that's a great one. Thank you for sharing that. So yeah, so the work aspects that significantly relate to exhaustion, fatigue, or feelings of depletion are high emotional demands, lack of feedback, work-home interference, time pressure, and high caseloads. And then the work aspects that significantly relate to mental distance from work are things like lack of rewards and recognition, time pressure, and lack of job control. Generally, rates of burnout reported prior to the pandemic ranged from 21 to 67% of behavioral health employees. A recent poll found that 93% of healthcare workers are experiencing regular stress and 76% report exhaustion, aspects we know relate to burnout. Furthermore, healthcare workers were asked if they experienced an increase in any of the following in the last 3 months. And as you see down here at the bottom, right, 82% of healthcare workers reported an increase in emotional exhaustion, 70% reported an increase in sleep trouble, physical exhaustion, 68%, work-related dread, change in appetite. So these are some significant increases in these symptoms that we know are problematic in a healthcare work environment or human services work environment. Also, somebody else said cognitive dissonance, the nature of work is not consistent with the personality of the worker. Yes, I love that you said that. We're definitely going to talk a little more about that as we go through. So part of the difficulty of burnout is what happens to people after burnout. According to the Cusp catastrophe model, as people experience more stress, their ability to manage that stress goes up somewhat. However, after a certain point of stress, they not only go down in their ability to manage stress, but they are less capable of managing their stressors than before. So if an employee is fully experiencing burnout, it is not enough to simply put them back down to their baseline of stressors that they had before. They now have a new baseline and kind of a new normal that they will need to help them heal from burnout again. So maybe this feels a little overwhelming, right? Like in terms of when we talk about burnout, when we talk about these things, sometimes they can feel bigger than the things that we can do about it, right? Especially in the midst of a pandemic where there is just a higher need for help for human service workers to reduce symptoms of burnout, where there's a higher need of human service workers in general across our entire population. So it can feel a little bit like a big task. However, I want to remind ourselves that while burnout can seem scary and maybe even unpreventable, it isn't. There is plenty of research that demonstrates that proactive burnout prevention results in lower levels of stress and burnout symptoms. And research shows that the three most important elements in taking care of burnout in employees is quality and effective leadership, plus healthy work culture, particularly demonstrated by procedure and policy, and high career quality. And the kind of nice part about working in human service in particular is that 70% of human service workers find their careers meaningful and of quality. So that part is almost always, in part at least, taken care of, as long as they have the capability to behave as they believe fits their values in that role. Cultural fit is arguably one of the most important pieces, aspects of retention and keeping employees engaged. When an organization's culture aligns with the work to be done and the personalities with the work styles of employees, staff are more likely to enjoy their time at work. Culture is overreaching. Culture is the overreaching field, including everything from the physical workspace to the behaviors within the organization. It includes the values practiced within the organization in action and intention. And much too often, organizations adopt values on paper, but don't always see them through with aligned actions. If collaboration is stated as one of your values, cubicles or open workspaces can foster more collaboration than offices traditionally. And obviously with certain human services aspects, that's not feasible, but what sorts of shared environments are there for them? And again, like with a pandemic, how do you maybe structure those activities in a safe way? So it can be challenging to consider some of these aspects, but as we go through the rest of today, but also the rest of this series, we will talk more and more about ways in which the organization can support employees. So what happens when organizational culture isn't healthy? Workers experiencing burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress can lead to increased stress in coworkers. And this is particularly true when there aren't good policies and procedures in place to help protect employees. Workers experiencing high levels of stress are likely to impact one another via conflict, imbalanced workloads, and inappropriate interactions. It is during times of stress that policies and procedures around conflict resolution, diversity, and inclusion are particularly important, as workers are more likely to rely on their biases when communicating and interacting when they're stressed, and they're more likely to react inappropriately while at work. Good workplace norms and structures can prevent this, but a lack of workplace structures can make this worse. Furthermore, employees differentially absorb stress from the different types of coworkers. One study demonstrated that nurses absorb stress from leaders, colleagues, and patients, whereas doctors only absorb stress from their colleagues. Thus, stress contagion may be hierarchical in nature, which means that leaders have to be thoughtful about the way that they interact with their employees, as their stressors, right? A leader's stressors, aspects of the job they care about, may become stressors for their employees, aspects that are not necessarily a part of their employee's job. Once again, it's important to note that organizational component in this. If an organization has procedures and policies that encourage reflection of power dynamics, it is easier for leaders and supervisors to redirect their stressors appropriately. And as I mentioned, when agency policies or systems make it difficult for workers to behave in line with their values, that feeling can be described as a betrayal and results in a lack of fulfillment and satisfaction in work. If organizations do not have policies in place to protect employees, the factors that are a part of a leader's or supervisor's job can often be placed on the shoulders of employees. Specifically, if it's a supervisor or leader's role to focus on aspects such as employee productivity and billable hours. Without the proper workplace culture, employees can quickly get caught up in also having to focus on things like productivity and billable hours instead of their job, which is quality human services care, which goes hand in hand with increasing productivity and billable hours, right? We have seen the research that demonstrates when employees are engaged in their work and feel professionally efficacious in their work, meaning confident in their ability to do that work, then they are going to be more productive. They are going to have more billable hours. So when human service workers begin to focus on other aspects of their job, they sometimes find the quality of their care decreasing, which results in feelings of shame, grief, meaninglessness, and remorse. Some of the recent research regarding moral injury highlights that it can look similar to burnout, and for some, maybe a better reframe of burnout, as burnout focuses more on individual resiliency and can be associated with stigma and shame when one starts to experience its symptoms, whereas moral injury reminds us more of the system's role. As one individual defined, moral injury is a deep soul wound that pierces a person's identity, sense of morality, and relationship to society. Similarly, value discrepancy is when an individual employee's values differ or are perceived to differ from their workplace's values. Incongruence of workers' personal values and the way they perceive the agency values can lead to decreased productivity and factors of burnout, such as exhaustion, cynicism, and lower professional efficacy. As highlighted by moral injury, value discrepancy is particularly important to human service workers. It's important for them that their work and their workplace matches their values so that they can do the work that they perceive to be meaningful and useful in their life. So here we have some sample values adapted from Schwartz's 2012 value discrepancy questionnaire. Which of these values would you rank as your organization's maybe top 2 or top 3 values? And I'll let y'all, if you feel comfortable, chatting in. And you can say on paper or not. I know last time I think I didn't wait long enough. Maybe my connection is being a little slow. There we go. So we have power, achievement, self-direction, equality, benevolence, tradition, security, relationships, communication, respect of cultural differences, and meaning. So someone said benevolence, tradition, probably top 2. Thank you for sharing that. Self-direction, equality, most of them are important. Yes, absolutely. Tradition, security, and power, someone else shared with me. Thank you. So I appreciate y'all sharing these with me because it's important for us to, and as we go through, we're going to talk more about assessment next time, but it's important for us to evaluate ourselves where we're at and where we think we are. Someone else said self-direction, equality, and relationships. Someone else said equality. Oh, I lost it. Equality, benevolence, relationships, tradition and power, cultural differences and benevolence, equality and respect of cultural differences, respect of cultural differences. Thank y'all. Excellent. So some things to think about in terms of this isn't every single value off of Schwartz's questionnaire. And again, some of them are adapted partially because we recognize that there are differences in cultural values, right? The diversity of our workforce now forces us to think more about what are the diversity of the values of our workers and how do we diversify our own values as an organization as well. So as I said, right, what are your organization's values? Some of y'all answered this. Do your policies, procedures, and leadership behaviors reflect those values? So that's the second kind of big question here. Employees also may have a different perception of the organization's values based on whether or not they perceive the actions to meet the meaning. So maybe for some of you, the wheels are turning right now and thinking, okay, how do I know that my employees know that this is what we value? How do I know that, or maybe even you're thinking to yourself, well, we'd like our values to be here, but really I think our values are here. So maybe you're already thinking about ways in which the culture of your organization might be impacting these stressors, right? And especially, as I mentioned before, when employees perceive those differences. If I'm an employee in a human service worker job, and to me, meaning, benevolence, and equality or respect of cultural differences are 3 of the 4 of the biggest things to me, but I perceive things like power and achievement and tradition or even security as more important to my workplace, it's going to make it difficult for me to feel included, to feel like I belong, and to feel like I'm doing a good job. And that also reflects back again on the organization in terms of what are the values of the employees you hire and how does that relate to the meaning and purpose they find in their work, right? So how are you evaluating your employees that you hire and the roles that you're hoping for them to fill and what values you think they should have? All right, another chat-in, but so the way to avoid burnout is what? So we've talked about a lot of different things very quickly, but what, now that we've gotten here? How do we avoid burnout? Is there one way? Work-life balance, someone said. Encouraging staff to take vacation time. Resiliency, ensuring leadership culture and job quality. Thank you for the person who said ensuring leadership culture and job quality promote the employee. I give you all the love. More time off, reasonable workloads seem key. Also financial wages, employee engagement, pacing yourself, creating an environment that supports job satisfaction, reflects work value. So some of you are really listening, which I appreciate. So again, we tend to honest expectations. Oh, I love that one. Thank you so much for sharing that. Again, I'm asking this question because it's easy for us to go back to this idea of burnout as this individual resiliency model, right? It's easy for us to think about it in terms of that. But we also have to remember those organizational components as we go through this, the pieces where the organization can really support the employee in facilitating wellness, as you're mentioning over and over again. Not looking at staff as products, but people. Ooh, that's a tough one. That's a good one though. C-level officers actually meeting face-to-face with the people in the trenches. Ooh, I like that too. So you guys are getting at a lot of the different things that we have touched on, right? With stress contagion, how leadership might not feel always the effects of what their employees are going through, and how it's important for workplaces to promote resiliency. Yes, thank you, workplace resiliency, but it has to be from the top down. Thank you, Anthony. That's excellent. Exactly what I'm getting at. So, right, exactly. Leadership plus culture plus career quality, these are these important factors, and it's not just on the individual. Obviously, there are aspects to that we're going to talk about when we talk about assessment and when we talk about hiring. And also TAC has additional other offerings that focus on hiring the right employee and how to figure that out. But we also understand that human service work is hard. It is hard, and it requires an individual to be resilient, and most human service workers know that. Right? We can trust that most human service workers have an understanding that they have to be resilient, that they have to have their own individual skills in place. And from the organizational level, we have to recognize we have to support our employees, that a real model of equity means supporting people with what they need. It means fairness. It's not giving each person the same exact thing and hoping that they just go off to do the best that they can, but recognizing that different employees are going to need different things. And how do we meet them where they are? And how do we train them up so that they can be the best employee they can be, so that they can do the work that they find meaningful, and so that we can focus on, in terms of leadership and organizations, we can focus more on the pieces that is our job, right? Making sure that they're staying in their jobs, but also making sure that they have satisfaction and that the healthcare going out or the human services going out is of quality, right? Going back to that quadruple Ames model. So again, as we mentioned previously, I'm just throwing this model back up here. How do people interact and react to change within your organization? How does that relate to the component of supervisee subordinate relationships? Right? So thinking about the way in which maybe your supervisors interact with one another, but also how your leadership interacts with subordinates, if they interact at all. As someone mentioned, sometimes we need more face-to-face meetings. So as mentioned above, at least a third of employees are reporting supervisor relationships as a stressor to them, right? And also on that ranking list of reasons why people stayed, the third reason was supervisor subordinate relationships. So it's clearly an important aspect to why they leave an organization. And those relationships are shaped by the culture of the organization. So supervision, particularly in human services, is a parallel process with human service delivery, right? There's modeling of behaviors to subordinates. There's communication that's either effective or ineffective. There's empathy or lack of empathy. And then there's tracking. So one of the places where maybe leadership or supervision gets a little stuck is modeling. So example, Say this is the third team meeting in a month, or that we've had in 2 months, talking about self-care and work-life boundaries, as many of you mentioned, right? Work-life boundaries are really important for good self-care and for preventing burnout. So we discussed the importance of booking breaks, ending sessions on time so that we have time to use the bathroom, to drink water, to eat lunch. But maybe we also end the meeting 5 minutes after the scheduled time it's supposed to end. And maybe during the meeting, there's a supervisor who's emailing several employees indicating they need to book a meeting during a time when they would have taken breaks today. So how does the organization better structure boundaries and work-life balance? Are there policies in place, or are we making assumptions that, oh, well, the supervisors are just going to take care of it, right? Do workers even get rewarded for setting good boundaries and demonstrating good work-life balance, or do they feel punished for that? So it's important to remember that, and this is not, again, just on the supervisor, but also just on the organization itself. How is the organization modeling through policy, procedure, and also rewarding or encouraging appropriate behaviors in their leadership, or are they? So the work-life balance piece, the boundaries piece, the time management piece too. Are leadership modeling good time management, or is there a lot of emailing, 2 seconds before a meeting with some things to do or some things to review? How often do these things happen, and how might they be better structured if the organization took these things into consideration, made more structured policies around this? And I know I'm being maybe a little bit vague, but right, we're going to talk about solutions at the end of session, or in session 4. So then communication, another example. All staff receive supervision once a week, and during those supervision meetings, much of the time is focused on discussing caseloads, productivity, and no-show rates. Staff feel overwhelmed, but aren't sure if they can use that time to discuss their feelings and try and receive support. So again, how often you communicate and what you communicate about are meaningful, particularly from a top-down level. What is the organization doing in terms of procedures that structure the aspects of relationships or communication around these things? If supervisors are talking a lot with their subordinates about productivity and no-show rates and billings, is there another place that supervisors need to get that support then? Is there structure for supervisors to get that support for them to do their jobs so that the subordinates can focus, so the human service workers, the direct human service workers can focus on doing their jobs? And sometimes there's a little bit of muddling of those roles. You have individuals who are doing both human service work and also leadership management roles, right? So how does an organization best navigate to help that individual structure their time again, so that they're not always talking to employees whose role is really to just do the direct human service work, rather than putting on their shoulders the concerns of the organization as a whole? Other things to consider, right? Do the employees feel heard? What types of language are used? What's the tone even of that language? And what about the timing of communication? Are you checking in with employees during the last 5 minutes of a meeting? Is that really a good time to check in with them? Is that really a good time for them to feel like they're going to get heard in that 5 minutes? What happens if there's conflict? Are there policies and procedures from the organizational level of conflict resolution, of how to handle power dynamics, or even reflect on power dynamics? These things can be key in healthy communication. And more specifically, things like trauma-informed and culturally sensitive communication is really important in creating an equitable communication environment. Next, we have empathy. So maybe you have another example where someone in leadership gets informed of conflict occurring between a supervisor and a subordinate, and specifically the subordinate is reporting the supervisor, maybe communicates a task, but then becomes upset when the task isn't done to their specification. Maybe their communication isn't very specific to begin with. And the subordinate feels their boundaries are being pushed because they're constantly being pushed to work on this or prioritize this above their own other work that they maybe value more. So the leader maybe encourages the subordinate to communicate directly with the supervisor about their difficulty, which sounds good. Most of us would encourage conflict resolution to occur between the two people that conflict is occurring between. That's just genuine good conflict management. And maybe also the leader specifically states something like, well, that supervisor has great relationships with other subordinates, so maybe if you just talk it out with them, it'll result in something better. But again, are we validating that person's emotions in that moment? First of all, is that leader validating the emotions of that person in that moment? Are there policies and procedures in place to encourage healthy communication, or is there a potential punishment waiting for this subordinate by talking to this manager in this way? Are there structures for conflict resolution that they can follow that will encourage a healthy conflict resolution, or are they just expected to kind of do this on the fly? Furthermore, right, is it validating to tell a subordinate that a supervisor is great at their job if they've come to you with a difficulty with that supervisor? Maybe not. So these are small examples that can demonstrate sometimes a larger culture of issues occurring within a workplace without even realizing it. There are gaps in the communication and empathy that could do a lot for reducing this worker's stress. There's pieces of power dynamics, of value discrepancy, and then potentially also microaggressions, right? When we talk about employees who are members of oppressed groups, it's important for us to recognize the differences in communication, the differences in cultural values, and how those things might impact the type of relationship they have with a supervisor who maybe is typically considered great. Maybe that supervisor is really great at communicating with, majority group members, but maybe when it comes to minority group members, they have less success. And that's something that should be evaluated from the top down, not something that we should be putting directly on the supervisor alone or on the subordinates alone, definitely not. So then maybe how do we track how our employees are doing, or do we track how our employees are doing? When do they get to evaluate supervisors, if ever? And what is the timing of that communication? Is it during a time period when, is it expected as part of something extra for them to do? So like, oh, you don't have to evaluate this person, but you can. And so the people who evaluate them are maybe more likely to have a need to evaluate, whereas the people who don't maybe are more of those middle ground individuals. Or maybe if you're evaluating your employees, maybe you're using something like productivity as a measure of a worker's success, or maybe even if you're trying to evaluate burnout, maybe you use the ProQual. But how often are you tracking things like burnout? How often are you tracking the productivity? Is it mandatory, or are employees allowed to skip it? And what does that mean what's the culture around that, right? What is the organization doing to support healthy tracking first and foremost, but also consistent tracking? We know that sometimes, if you have an individual who takes the ProQual once every 6 months, that's not always going to be ideal in terms of timelining. That person might have had external things that happen to them that are relating to their burnout, or they might be, it's harder for them internally to keep track of how they're doing when it's 6 months ago that I last filled this out. I'm not even thinking now about how I was doing then, and how do I track that data? So again, how often are the employees assessed? And even more importantly, is that assessment punishing, right? So maybe you are assessing for burnout, but what happens when an employee hits that cutoff? Is the organization making decisions for that employee without their permission, or not collaboratively? If an employee is being evaluated on productivity, is that used to develop equitable plans to help that employee manage their stress? Or is that used to hold over their head in terms of, well, you're not meeting your productivity this month, and we need you to meet your productivity, so we need you to do X, Y, and Z, and now there's more of a workload feeling on the employee rather than a supported feeling? How are we communicating those things is really, really important. And that punishing piece is so key, because so often we want to track, it's same thing for a client, right? In human service work, if we're tracking a client and a client comes in and their mood is lower than it's been for the last 3 weeks, are we going to tell them, oh, you're not doing your skills, you're not doing your good resiliency? I hope not, right? I hope that we would have empathy for that client, and we would say, hey, what's going on? And hey, how do we support you? And that's also maybe a little normative, right? That there are mood shifts. And so maybe it's a little normative that we see productivity shifts, that we see these shifts in employees, and maybe we should treat it a little bit more empathetically and compassionately, rather than as something to make them think about individually. So lastly, what kind of leader or supervisor do you want to be? Again, this is leading us into evaluation. I know we've been talking a little bit about evaluation now, and we're definitely going to talk about this more in session 3 or training 3, but how effective do you think your leadership is, right? Rate 1 to 5 for yourself. And how would others rate your leadership? Are there discrepancies or are there blind spots depending on who that individual is? So we have a self-assessment that's linked here, so you can kind of check that out on the MTAC website afterwards. That measures these different aspects of leadership. So we have social perceptiveness, which is the capacity to accurately analyze social situations, social perceptiveness to acquire and interpret social information. And then you have social dexterity, which is behavioral flexibility to take necessary action, responding in different ways to different situations. Then you have motivation to lead, which is the motivated use of cognitive and behavioral capabilities, the motivation to exert influence, to take leadership positioning, to make decisions. Then you have visioning, which is scanning for idealized future states, constantly thinking of more attractive futures that promotes others or creates a better situation for the organization or members. Goal setting and planning, which is pretty self-explanatory in terms of are you consistently setting goals? Are you planning for those goals in ways that are structured? And then ethical leader behavior. Is this leader abusing their influence of power? Do they manipulate others? Do they attempt to influence others for their own good over the good of others? Or are they promoting any sort of potentially corruptive behavior? And here's kind of what this looks like just for your information, right? So you have your own rating that you can do, and then you have M1, M2, M3, which are just basically other individuals in your workplace that you can have evaluate you on these rubrics. So this is the social perceptiveness scale. And here you have this rubric that demonstrates kind of where you may be, or where any leader may be on it. And so again, this is just an example, not to necessarily put all of this on leaders necessarily, but also this is an example of how organizations can structure these things. Are leaders being evaluated? Are they being evaluated consistently? And are they being evaluated for the purpose of growth of the organization and the agency, but also the caretaking and well-being of the employees there? So now that we maybe better understand the causes of turnover a little bit, let's consider some areas we can learn more. Here we have some additional TAC resources. I have that self-assessment linked here so that once all these materials are posted after the recording, you can take a look at them yourself, maybe give yourself, I would strongly encourage between now and next week, maybe even for you to look at it and see where you are. Here's a burnout response for leaders, trauma-informed supervision, leadership during times of crisis, leadership blind spots. So some leadership kind of specific examples for you to take a look at if you're interested in learning more. And then again, just a reminder, so next week we have on May 12th at 11 a.m. we have assessing turnover, and then our final solutions to turnover will be May 19th at 12 p.m. And we're going to talk more about the good work at that point. And then some additional CTAC resources. So there's some supervision webinars that are linked here and some online learning modules on work wellness and resilience linked here. If you haven't checked those out before, I strongly recommend it. And questions, any questions that y'all have, I would love to take them. Yes, thank you, Paula. So Paula suggests when teaching new staff, we have to realize that not everyone learns the same way. So be prepared to have it broken down so you can get all the staff on the same page. Absolutely. There is a lovely, oh yes, yeah, we also have a feedback survey that's linked there. Thank you. But yes, there's some lovely onboarding materials that TAC has that are really great to help you kind of further flesh out your onboarding. And as we pointed out in the first session, onboarding, the more time you spend on onboarding doesn't actually cost that much more money in comparison to having that turnover. So if you spend 5 more hours on onboarding and then that reduces your turnover rate by something like, 3 to 7%, that could save you a lot more money than it's probably costing you. How do you deal with the disgruntled employee? Well, I think that's a really good question. And I think there's a variety of different things to consider. Typically the disgruntled employee is not in a vacuum, right? There's a variety of factors that are contributing, as I pointed out throughout today, there's a variety of factors that are contributing to their disgruntled feelings. And I think the important thing to consider is, how do you deal with a disgruntled client, right? How do we deal with disgruntled people in general? If you want to create a supportive and nurturing atmosphere, then the best way to start may be to consider, right, that equitable response. Well, first, let me hear you out, right? As the disgruntled employee, let me hear you out. Let me listen to your grievance and kind of get a feel for what's going on. And then let me figure out a way to respond in a supportive way to you, right? Going back to some of these kind of pieces. And like I said, we're going to talk about this more in solutions, absolutely. But so, are they feeling supported and empathized with, or do they feel like they're not? And what are the power dynamics in the people who are communicating with them, right? If you're a supervisor or a leader and you have a disgruntled employee and you bring 3 leaders into a meeting with that disgruntled employee, are they going to feel safe to have that conversation, or are they going to feel overpowered, right? They're already overpowered with 1 leader, but now you have 3. So you want to be mindful about reactionary communication versus a more, what's the word that, like the proactive, ethical kind of communication, right? So let's take a pause about our own feelings. Wait, what's that? Use the different models to better understand why. Yeah. So again, going back to someone else suggested so there's these pieces, but then there's also the models, right? So looking at the models of moral injury and value discrepancy as to understand why, but then also trying to meet, like I said, meet them where they're at, discovering what the causes are can help in addressing them, but also talking to them in a respectful and maybe trauma-informed way can be a really helpful starting place. Do you have any best practices that we may be able to employ to keep productivity goals met while verbalizing to employees the importance of client care and not necessarily those specific productivity goals? Excellent question. So I don't have a specific best practice because, again, as we mentioned throughout, and hopefully I can talk about this a little more too, like make sure this is included in the next sessions, but because this is hard in terms of productivity goals need to be met. But client care needs to be taken first. So I think my stance is less of the best practice isn't always going to be what works for your organization in particular. Sorry, I'm just moving back over here. The best practice isn't always going to be what's best for your agency or your individual in particular, but generally, how do you communicate? Same with a client trying to meet their goals. How do you communicate with an employee about them meeting their goals, right? What do they need to meet those goals? And so I think that you can have a conversation about productivity with them. You can bring that up with them, and you just have to be mindful about how punishing or rewarding that conversation is. I hope that makes sense. I don't know if someone was jumping on to say something.
Yeah, Mary, I was gonna jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, no. One of the things I learned by working with Mary on this series was the concepts of the value discrepancy and moral injury, but particularly in this case the value discrepancy. I mean, over the years, what I've like whoever asked the question had to do is make sure that staff hit their productivity standards, and without a balance of what that means in terms of the quality of the work that the clinicians are doing, you end up with this value imbalance between what you say as an agency, which is there's nothing in the mission statement of any agency, I don't think, about meeting productivity. There's a lot about quality and meeting the needs of the community. So tying productivity with the quality of the work somebody's doing, but understanding. But doing work to help staff understand how that ties to the mission, so you lessen that moral that ambiguity between what somebody feels in terms of what what it feels like you're only interested in productivity and money, but really you're interested in that because it produces high quality, high volume work for a community that needs it. So there's a way of, I've found by listening to what Mary's been presenting, there's a construct there about shortening that value discrepancy between staff and what you see as necessity being the need for productivity. So I hope that helps.
Yes, hopefully. We had another really good question, which someone asked: what happens when workers see a worker is not doing their job, and after the person is terminated, starts making a ton of false allegations that impacts the team? That's a really good question. And I think that, again, this comes back to some of those organizational procedures and policies in terms of how do you determine, how do you manage conflict resolution? Is there a structure for it that's consistent? And also, what is your take on accountability? So, sure, we could fire every single person that gets an allegation against them in terms of not doing their job. And we have to be mindful about ways to handle accountability internally. And I think this is an ongoing conversation to be had, again, for your organization specifically, but also broadly. There's not one right way. And I know that's like not the best answer, but in terms of if you find a method, if you find a worker who's creating or who is potentially abusing a policy, how do you shift or review that policy to shift how much of an impact that ends up having when someone attempts to abuse it, right? What is the system doing that's allowing for abuse of itself, if that makes sense?
And again, I think the people making false allegations will happen, but having as transparent a workplace as possible is a protection against that, and also treating staff fairly.
Yes.
I mean, that may sound like a very obvious answer to that, but treating staff fairly and ensuring that what we do in the workplace is discipline and hold people accountable who are not doing their jobs, so that people who are doing their jobs see that what we do is take seriously the values that we have. People who make false allegations within that framework will stand out obviously. Don't treat staff fairly, don't hold people accountable who are abusing their positions, not following protocols or whatever. It becomes very murky. So again, transparency and being very clear about your values and applying them is critical, I think, to help with that.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Chris. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. These are really excellent.
Mary, I would jump in with an additional thing to some of the things you've been talking about. And that would be really the concept of the stress contagion, and to take a kind of a long view to these problems. Try not to look at, a disgruntled employee as an isolated incident, but rather look at the kind of what situations might have led up to this, irregardless of the person's personality. Is this a larger issue? Because sometimes the people that are the squeaky wheels, the ones that come to you with the anger and the problems, can be kind of your best friend, in that they are a venting that's drawing your attention to what could be a underlying problem. And that's the problem with stress contagion, is it can kind of bubble up slowly, and it can spread out slowly and more and more and more. And if you're unaware of it, it's hard to address it. So, try to look at the bigger picture with all of these things.
Yes, thank you, Carson. I think that's a good review of some of the things too throughout. Yeah, I think overall, the reminder is that there's all these different terms, but at the end of the day, how are things being communicated, and how are the relationships and the culture of the organization being treated? If they're being left to their own devices, sometimes that's when you really see a lot of these things develop in a negative way. And I'm not seeing any other questions just yet, but I'm going to give y'all just another moment. And Chris, I don't know if you were about to say something else.
Nope.
Okay. Sorry.
It's been over. No.
Yeah, okay. What's the best way to reduce stress contagion when it has seeped into several members of the team? Thank you for that question. Yes, I think, again, it comes down to the culture of, and by the culture, I mean the organization's procedure and policy around how people relate. So you typically have in a human service environment a pretty interrelated team that's pretty expected in terms of the culture. And how do you promote, again, those like values that are meaningful to them in a tangible way, right? So those values of, you know, if the team's values are centered around healthy communication or equality or fairness or just meaning in their work, doing their best work, how do you, as an organization, encourage them to focus on those aspects structurally throughout their day, is the first thing that I think about.
I would underline when you were talking about boundaries earlier, to have a clear understanding of professional boundaries. A collaborative leadership practices also are helpful in these kind of things. You know, frankly, just taking the time to discuss with people is a big step towards addressing this. And then I would say, you know, an emphasis on workplace civility would be another good thing. And then to just lead by example.
Yeah, Carson, I think that's a really good point. And I think also I'd like to highlight the caution around the punishment piece, that sometimes when you are trying to encourage something positive, it can come across as invalidating, right? So you want to be also cautious about the language you use there in terms of, are you telling them to stop complaining, is what it sounds like, or are you trying to encourage them to focus on some aspects of their work that they have made explicit they care about, I guess is the way that I would frame that. Because I think oftentimes when we blanket workforce employees with, well, we've heard a lot of grumblings lately, that there's often this kind of internal feeling of like shame or blame or punishment. And so, you know, that again, focusing on some of how do we reward the models of the behaviors we're looking to see, and how do we promote that workplace civility, as Carson was saying, is really important in a rewarding way and less of a punishing way.
I think the lesson of these sessions really is that your staff are stressed, some more than others, and if it's left alone, it will spread, and your staff will become stressed by other staff who are stressed. So the best way of addressing stress contagion is to sit down with staff and talk about their stress, talk about ways of dealing with it, and how can the agency help. And you know, we've got productivity standards to meet, we know all that, but you're stressed, and what do we do about it? So confronting it, it's there, it's going to be there. And you know, one of those brutal truths of the work we deal with it, we work in, is that the staff are going to be feeling very stressed. And so approaching it from a positive way and upfront, let's talk about it.
Yes.
And I would underline that too, Chris. I was thinking along the same lines, and it's just, you know, it's the same with anyone who goes to therapy. A large part of why people go to therapy is not to have a therapist talk to them, but to just open up to a therapist, to let the stress out, because stress is bubbling and it's going to be there. And unless you find, you know, constructive outlets for it, you know, it may bubble over at some point. And so to have those kind of constructive outlets built into the organization, you know, a monthly gripe session, informal, you know, gatherings, to have the little sessions where people can gather and kind of talk and unwind in a constructive manner, as opposed to just, you know, having to do it behind the scenes
Yes, Carson, and I hate to interrupt you, but just in the idea of modeling good boundaries, we are at 1 o'clock. So thank you all for your attendance today, but I am going to go ahead and let everyone go because they have other work to do. So thank you. And please attend parts 3 and 4 where we talk more about these solutions.
Well, thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much. Have a
Thank you
wonderful
all.
day.